Now, during the secession winter, Seward had a lot of arbitrary power, no? How did he get that power, and how did he use it?
Well, Seward, during the secession winter, he is still perceived as the leader of the Republican Party. Lincoln is back here in Illinois, in Springfield, pretty cut off, other than letters from what's going on in Washington. And so, akin to what's going on right now in Washington, a Senate leader is perceived as the sort of person with whom one's going to have a negotiation. Seward was perceived as the Northern Republican with whom the Southerners, Jefferson Davis, perhaps Hunter, were going to have a negotiation to try to work out some form of compromise.
Do you think he was more of a politician or a statesman or both?
I think he was both. Let's come back to the movie. I think that one of the great things about the movie is that it shows Lincoln and Seward doing a very statesman-like thing, ending slavery in America, but doing so through political means. You couldn't do it without the votes, as Seward points out to Lincoln at the beginning of the movie, and you were going to have to get some Democratic votes, and those votes weren't going to come cheaply. You were going to have to offer some things to get things done. So I think Seward would perceive that as almost a false dichotomy. In order to achieve great things, you have to use political means.
And people are political animals, nonetheless.
Right.
Lloyd in Charlotte, North Carolina, asked a question: when did Mr. Seward's relationship with Abraham Lincoln change, and would you say that they were the closest of those in the cabinet?
I'd say that the relationship changes during the course of 1861 as Seward gets to know Lincoln better. Remember that Lincoln doesn't have a long Washington career before, right? And that career actually kind of predates Seward's time. Lincoln's one term of Congress is just before Seward arrives as a federal senator. And so they meet once in 1848. They meet a second time in 1860 during the campaign, but by the time Lincoln arrives in Washington, Seward doesn't really know him very well during those first few weeks. But by summer of 1861, fall of 1861, they begin to be not just rivals but friends. Hard to judge, levels of friendship, but yes, I think Seward was the person within the cabinet with whom Lincoln was friendliest. It's always hard for a president to have friends. Harry Truman famously said that if you wanted a friend in Washington, you should get a dog. and I think that Lincoln might well have said the same thing, but indicative perhaps of the closeness of the relationship, Seward presented Lincoln with a couple of kittens. And Seward's daughter describes how Lincoln... Fanny describes in her diary how Lincoln would get down on the floor of the White House to play with the kittens, which I think is a wonderful image. But through Fanny's diary, through the family letters, you get a real sense that the Lincoln and Seward families were close, not just the two men.
Well, they certainly came to respect each other, no?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And I think the same thing had to have happened with Stanton, for that matter. We'll know in your next book.
Right.
I'm going to jump back for 1 second, then I'm going to go back to the cabinet. What were Seward's characteristics? Ambition, certainly. Honesty, certainly. In post-mortem, I don't want to kill him off before the show's over, but in post-mortems, Gideon Wells, Henry, and Charles Adams both spoke about him. Did they get him right? They at least surrounded him, I think.
Yeah, what are his characteristics? Well, we've talked a bit about his sociability, the cigar, the wine, but we haven't talked about the fact that he's a man who can pretty easily kind of chat with a coachman or a worker, and then march into a salon and chat with European nobility. People like him. Even people who are his political enemies like him. So during the 50s, when Jefferson Davis is his colleague in the Senate, Davis and Seward are friends. When Davis is confined to his room by eye illness, Seward comes every day to cheer up his friend, to tell him stories of the Senate. So his likability, his diligence. The amount of work the man does during the Civil War is just mind-boggling. the daily pile of mail coming in from overseas, and the mail that he drafts in his own hand and sends out is mind-boggling. So those are some of his personal characteristics.
Let's go back to the cabinet.
Okay.
Whom was he close with? Whom wasn't he? What were the dynamics of Seward in that cabinet?
Okay. Well, I'd say the person with whom he's closest is Lincoln. And this is a subject of some annoyance to his cabinet colleagues because many of them, Chase and Wells in particular, Gideon Wells, the Secretary of the Navy, and Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, have this notion that issues should be decided around the cabinet table, sort of by all the colleagues in a free discussion. And so they are, to say the least, annoyed by the fact that often important issues are decided between Lincoln and Seward just in a one-on-one before the cabinet meeting, in the evening before, they are also annoyed by what they perceive as Seward's interference in their affairs. Seward was, he didn't view himself as merely about foreign affairs. So if there was a naval issue that had an arguable foreign aspect, Seward would decide it. Mm-hmm. Indeed, famously at the outset of the war, Seward directs naval officers to take certain ships on certain missions.
How did Gideon Wells think about that?
Gideon Wells was damn upset about it.
He writes that in his diary?
He writes that in his diary. And part of what makes writing this book a little hard is that Seward does not himself keep a diary during the Civil War. So what we have, the voluminous diary of Gideon Wells and the diary of Chase, and we have the enemy's version of Seward and not, in many cases, his own version of events.
Chase?
Chase is an interesting character because if you had asked at the beginning maybe of 1859, if you could have predicted the Lincoln cabinet and said which of these men are friends today, you would have said that Seward and Chase were friends. Seward and Chase had worked on a famous slavery case in the Supreme Court in the late 1840s or early 1840s. And they had kept up a friendly correspondence. Indeed, one of the warmest letters that Seward gets congratulating him on becoming Secretary of State is from Chase. But by the time of the inauguration, there are very definitely Chase wings of the party and Seward wings of the Republican Party, and they are in hot competition for all the federal positions that are out there. And so, in a sense, the friendship between the men falls victim to the rivalry between their subordinates. And indeed, Chase's friends were adamant that Lincoln should revoke his offer of Secretary of State to Seward. And some of Seward's friends were working equally hard to try to get Chase out of the cabinet. And this is even before the first cabinet meeting.
A question has come in that I was going to have my next question as well. Matt, would you please hold up this print? This is the Carpenter print, first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation that Carpenter did. It's in the huge oil painting is on the Senate side of the Capitol building, and takes up a stairwell. And you should go and see it. It's really something. But Ritchie did the engraving of this, and this sold like hotcakes. They always come in. They always have, you can see board on the back of it. They all have staining because of that. Now, Seward is credited with advising Lincoln to delay the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation until there's a victory. Some of this comes in from various, Whitlaw Reid said something about this in the paper. I don't know if that was a plant. You can ask me that. Carpenter also talked about that, another plant. And because Gideon Wells, who wrote on Executive Mansion Stationery, as you write, Stanton, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Who wrote on Executive Mansion Stationery during the meetings, said something differently. Why did he ask for a delay? Was he against emancipation?
Well, this is maybe the one point in the book.
Before you go on, I'm just going to say this is Jim from Janesville, Wisconsin, who had this question.
All right, so I better look directly at Jim out there. Okay, Jim.
Well, he'll be listening.
I think that the standard version that we have of this, which is really from Carpenter, Carpenter says that Seward said when Lincoln first read the proclamation, I support this in principle, but I question the timing. I think you should wait for a victory. That's Carpenter's version, and Reed has something similar. But the notes by Stanton say something a little different. The first words that Stanton records are Seward against. It isn't Seward, in favor of delay. It's Seward is against it. And then he goes on to talk about how Seward is concerned about the foreign policy aspects of it. He's concerned that there are people in Britain and France who are so keen to have Southern cotton and who see Southern cotton as only coming from Southern slaves, that if they see the war becoming a war against slavery, will intervene on the side of the South to support the flow of cotton. Now, there were other people in Britain and France who had other ideas, but that was one concern. Another concern that Seward had about an Emancipation Proclamation was that it would lead the Southern slaves to rise up in revolt, and that we would see in the South, scenes of murder and violence to make the organized war of the Civil War seem tame in comparison. So I think Seward says something a little different in that first meeting. I think he says, I have some real doubts. I'm against this, at least at the moment. But for heaven's sake, if you're going to do it, don't do it now. Mm-hmm. Which is a rather different thing than what Carpenter says. And my sources are not just Stanton's notes, but letters that Seward writes to Adams in London, letters between Seward and his wife. I mean, there's quite a bit of material during that summer, fall, winter about Seward's views about an Emancipation Proclamation.
This is kind of a throwaway. I just want to show this real quickly because I want to ask a question about John Hay. Here is John Hay, who was, everyone knows or should, that one of the secretaries for Lincoln, brought in by Nicolay in Illinois, actually. And here he is signing a document as Secretary of State, John Hay. Talking about protégés, what was the relationship of Seward and Hay?
And young Hay. It's clear we have, fortunately, although Seward doesn't keep a diary, Hay did keep a diary off and on, and it's clear from that diary that Hay loved to go over and share a cigar and a glass of wine with Seward. Seward lives, I should mention, during the war, mere steps from the White House. He lives on Lafayette Square, and so for Hay to wander from the White House, where he lives during the war, over to Seward's, or for Seward to wander over to the White House is a matter of minutes. And they spend a lot of time together during the war, and then as the war is coming to an end, really more, I should say, as Lincoln's second term is beginning to start, just as today people in the White House and the State Department are looking as to what they're going to do other than be part of the second Obama administration. Well, Hay was looking for something less grueling than being White House secretary, and his friend Seward found him a plum position in Paris. Nicolay actually goes to Paris as well, but they remained friends really right up through Seward's death in 1872, and I think Seward would have been very proud to know that his protege goes on to become Secretary of State.